Deep in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, where the mist clings to ancient limestone cliffs and the forests grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates the canopy, there existed in 1876 a cabin that locals refused to approach after nightfall. The structure sat isolated on a ridge overlooking a nameless creek, its logs darkened by decades of weather and smoke, its single window covered with oiled paper that glowed amber when candles burned within. Those few travelers who passed near the property reported hearing strange sounds carried on the wind, rhythmic chanting that seemed neither fully English nor any recognizable dialect, the laughter of young women that would suddenly cut off into silence, and occasionally the deep authoritative voice of a man issuing commands that echoed through the valleys. The nearest settlement, a collection of rough cabins and a general store some 8 miles distant, knew the property as the Crowley place, though most residents would cross themselves and change the subject when the name arose in conversation. What happened within those walls remained hidden from the outside world for years, a secret maintained by isolation, fear, and the absolute control one man exercised over his own flesh and blood. The story begins not in 1876, but 2 decades earlier, when Ezekiel Crowley, a widower of 35 years, found himself alone with 3 infant daughters after his wife Martha perished during their difficult birth. The triplets, identical in every visible way, were named Prudence, Patience, and Charity by their father, though he would later tell them these names represented not virtues, but conditions of their existence. Ezekiel had come to the Ozarks fleeing debts and whispered accusations in Kentucky, bringing with him a wagon full of books that neighbors found peculiar. Volumes on animal husbandry, ancient fertility rites, genealogical theories that predated modern science, and religious texts from obscure sects that preached doctrines the mainstream churches had condemned. He built his cabin far from others deliberately, claiming he needed solitude for his studies, but those who helped him raise the walls noticed he constructed it with unusual features: a single large room with no internal divisions, heavy bars on the inside of the door, and a root cellar accessed by a trap door that he insisted on finishing himself, allowing no one else to see its depths. As the girls grew from infancy to childhood, Ezekiel homeschooled them using his peculiar library, teaching them to read from texts that emphasized obedience, sacrifice, and the sacred duty of daughters to their father. He told them the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, filled with people who would separate them and destroy the special purpose for which they had been born. The triplets knew no other children, no other adults, no reality beyond the cabin and the small clearing where they tended a garden and kept chickens. Ezekiel trained them in all domestic tasks with military precision, but he also taught them something else, that they were not merely his daughters but participants in a great work, a restoration of ancient practices that would purify their bloodline and create something unprecedented. He showed them diagrams in his books, illustrations of family trees that looped back upon themselves, and explained in patient detail that the strongest traits emerged when the blood remained undiluted by outsiders. The girls, knowing nothing else, accepted these teachings as truth, their young minds shaped entirely by the only voice they ever heard. By the time Prudence, Patience, and Charity reached their 13th year, Ezekiel had prepared them for the transition he claimed was ordained by both nature and divine will. He conducted what he called the ceremony of understanding in the root cellar, a space he had transformed into a chapel of sorts, its walls covered with symbols copied from his oldest books and lit by candles arranged in patterns that cast dancing shadows across the earthen floor. There he explained that their 14th birthday would mark their transformation from daughters into something more, that the isolation of their lives had been necessary preparation for the roles they would assume. He spoke of biblical patriarchs who had built nations from their own families, of royal bloodlines maintained through brother-sister unions, of the scientific theories that claimed excellence could be concentrated through careful breeding. The girls listened with the trust of children who had never been given reason to question, their identical faces reflecting the candlelight as their father described the future he had planned, a future in which they would become not just his daughters, but his wives, bearing children who would carry forward the purest possible expression of the Crowley blood. The autumn of 1870 brought the 14th birthday of the triplets, and with it the first of the rituals that would define the next 6 years of their lives. Ezekiel had marked the date with preparations that began weeks in advance, special meals to strengthen their bodies, daily readings from his books to fortify their minds, and private conversations with each girl individually to ensure their acceptance of what was to come. On the appointed night, he dressed them in white gowns he had sewn himself, crowned them with wreaths of autumn leaves, and led them one by one into the root cellar, where he had prepared a bed of furs and blankets. What occurred in that underground chamber was witnessed by no one outside the family. But when dawn came, Ezekiel emerged and announced to the empty forest that the covenant had been sealed, that his daughters were now his wives, and that the great work of purifying the Crowley bloodline had begun. The girls, emerging pale and silent in the morning light, had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, bound to their father by acts that the outside world would condemn, but which they had been taught to see as sacred duty, the fulfillment of the purpose for which they had been born into isolation and raised in ignorance of any other possible life. The years that followed the ceremony established patterns that would govern every aspect of life in the cabin, routines designed by Ezekiel to maintain order and reinforce the hierarchy he had created. Each morning began before dawn, with prayers he had composed himself, lengthy invocations that praised the purity of their isolated family and asked blessings upon the children he anticipated would soon arrive. The triplets, now occupying the ambiguous role of both daughters and wives, performed their household duties with mechanical efficiency, their movements synchronized in the eerie way of siblings who had never been apart. They cooked meals over the stone fireplace, tended the garden that provided most of their food, preserved vegetables and meat for winter, and maintained the cabin with meticulous care. Ezekiel had established a rotation system for what he called private instruction, spending each night with a different girl while the other two slept in the loft he had built above the main room. He kept detailed journals documenting these encounters, recording dates and observations with the clinical detachment of a scientist conducting experiments, noting which girl showed the most compliance, which required additional guidance, and which he believed would prove most fertile. By the spring of 1871, Prudence showed the first signs of pregnancy, a development Ezekiel greeted with satisfaction that bordered on triumph. He increased her portions at meals, exempted her from the heavier chores, and spent long hours reading to her from texts about prenatal influences, convinced that the thoughts and words a mother encountered during pregnancy would shape the child's character. Patience and Charity continued their duties while watching their sister's body change, knowing their own transformations would likely follow. Ezekiel had explained his intention to keep all 3 wives pregnant as often as possible, believing that numerous offspring would increase the chances of producing children who embodied the concentrated excellence he sought. He had calculated that if each girl bore a child every 2 years, within a decade, he would have fathered 15 children, enough to begin the next phase of his plan, arranging marriages among his own grandchildren to further intensify the bloodline. The triplets listened to these projections with the passive acceptance that characterized their response to all his pronouncements. Their capacity for independent thought eroded by years of isolation and indoctrination. The birth of Prudence's child in late 1871 brought both joy and the first visible crack in Ezekiel's grand design. The infant, a boy he named Ezekiel Jr., appeared healthy at first, but within weeks began showing signs that troubled even his father's determined optimism. The child's eyes did not track movement properly. His limbs seemed weak and poorly coordinated, and he cried with an intensity that suggested pain rather than ordinary infant distress. Ezekiel consulted his books frantically, searching for explanations that would not undermine his theories, eventually convincing himself that the problems were temporary, a result of difficult labor rather than any flaw in his breeding philosophy. He forbade the girls from expressing concern, insisting that doubt would poison the atmosphere and harm future children. When Charity became pregnant 3 months later, he intensified the positive rituals, filling the cabin with constant affirmations about the strength and perfection of their bloodline. The girls, conditioned to obey, suppressed their private fears and continued performing their roles, though sometimes in the night the sound of infant Ezekiel's strange cries would cause them to lie awake in the darkness, wondering thoughts they dared not speak. As 1872 progressed, the cabin's population grew, and with it, the complexity of maintaining Ezekiel's controlled environment. Charity gave birth to a girl named Faith, who appeared more robust than her half-brother, and Patience's pregnancy advanced toward a winter delivery. Ezekiel now had 2 wives carrying his children, one recovering from birth, and an infant son whose developmental problems he refused to acknowledge even as they became more apparent. He responded to the increased demands by tightening his control, establishing more rules and rituals, assigning specific duties to each girl based on her current status as pregnant, nursing, or available for conception. The cabin that had once housed 4 people now contained 6, with more expected, and the isolation that had seemed merely unusual when the girls were children now took on a more sinister quality. There was no one to notice that Prudence had developed a persistent cough, no one to observe that Charity's eyes had acquired a haunted quality, no one to question why 3 young women in their prime seemed to move through their days with the resigned exhaustion of prisoners, serving sentences they did not understand. The winter of 1872 brought Patience's delivery, and with it a crisis that even Ezekiel could not ignore or explain away. The child, another boy he named Josiah, was born with visible abnormalities, a cleft palate that made nursing nearly impossible, fingers that were partially fused, and a cry that sounded more animal than human. For the first time since beginning his great work, Ezekiel's confidence wavered. He spent days in the root cellar alone, poring over his books, searching for passages that would help him understand what had gone wrong. The girls, left to care for 3 infants, including 2 with serious problems, began to whisper among themselves when their father was out of earshot, brief exchanges that represented the first independent thoughts they had dared to share in years. Prudence, the boldest, suggested quietly that perhaps the outside world's prohibitions against what they were doing had reasons behind them. Charity wondered aloud if their children's problems were punishment for violating natural law. Patience said nothing, but her silence carried its own weight of doubt. When Ezekiel emerged from his isolation, he had constructed a new narrative. The problems were tests of their faith, trials sent to strengthen their resolve, and they would be overcome through stricter obedience and more fervent dedication to the principles he had established. The girls, having no alternative and no knowledge of any other life, accepted this explanation and returned to their duties, but something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere, a crack in the foundation of absolute belief that would slowly widen over the years to come. The year 1873 marked a turning point in the cabin's hidden history, as the realities of Ezekiel's experiment became impossible to ignore even through the lens of his elaborate justifications. By spring, 3 children lived in the cabin. Ezekiel Jr., now 18 months old and still unable to sit up unassisted. Faith, who seemed healthy but had begun showing signs of developmental delay, not responding to her name or making eye contact, and Josiah, whose cleft palate required constant attention and specialized feeding that exhausted Patience. The triplets, all still in their teens, had become mothers to damaged children, while simultaneously remaining daughters and wives to the man who had authored all their roles. Ezekiel maintained his routines with rigid determination, continuing the rotation of private instruction, conducting his ceremonies in the root cellar, and filling his journals with observations that grew increasingly defensive in tone. He had begun to blame external factors for the children's problems: insufficient nutrition during pregnancy, negative thoughts harbored secretly by the girls, or spiritual attacks from the corrupt outside world that somehow penetrated their isolation. The arrival of a stranger in late spring shattered the cabin's sealed environment for the first time in years. A surveyor working for the railroad company that planned to extend lines through the Ozarks came upon the property while mapping the region. Emerging from the forest into the clearing, where Charity happened to be hanging laundry, while visibly pregnant with her second child. The man, startled to find habitation in such remote territory, approached with friendly greetings and questions about the family's needs and whether they knew about the development coming to the area. Charity, who had not spoken to anyone outside her family since early childhood, froze in terror, unable to respond. Ezekiel, hearing an unfamiliar voice, rushed from the cabin with his rifle and ordered the surveyor off his property with such vehemence that the man retreated immediately, but not before glimpsing through the open cabin door a scene that troubled him. Multiple young women who appeared identical, small children in conditions that seemed neglectful, and an atmosphere of fear that seemed excessive for a simple homestead. The surveyor reported what he had seen to authorities in the nearest town, but the distance, the difficulty of the terrain, and the general reluctance of officials to investigate remote family situations meant that no immediate action was taken. The encounter left Ezekiel paranoid and angry, convinced that the outside world was finally moving to destroy his work. He accelerated his plans, deciding that the family needed to become completely self-sufficient and prepared to defend their way of life against interference. He began stockpiling supplies purchased during increasingly rare trips to the distant general store, buying ammunition, preserved foods, and medical supplies with money he had hidden away years earlier. He also intensified the indoctrination of his daughter wives, conducting longer sessions in the root cellar where he preached about the persecution that awaited them if they were ever separated, describing in vivid detail how the authorities would tear their children away, lock the girls in asylums, and destroy everything they had built together. The triplets, already isolated and dependent, became even more fearful of the outside world, seeing it not as potential rescue, but as the threat their father described. When Charity gave birth to her second child in summer, a girl named Hope who appeared healthy at first, Ezekiel declared it a sign that they had weathered the test and that their bloodline was growing stronger. As autumn approached, the cabin housed 4 children and the 3 young mothers who cared for them while continuing to serve their father's needs. The daily routines had become more complex and exhausting, feeding children with special needs, managing the garden and livestock, preserving food for winter, and maintaining the elaborate system of rituals Ezekiel demanded. The girls, now 17 years old, looked older than their years, their faces drawn with fatigue, their bodies marked by repeated pregnancies, and the physical demands of their lives. Prudence had become pregnant again. Her third child conceived while she still nursed Ezekiel Jr. and tried to help him develop skills that other children his age had mastered months earlier. The cabin that had once seemed merely isolated now felt like a prison, its single room crowded with people and yet profoundly lonely, cut off from the human community that might have offered support, medical care, or simply the perspective that what was happening within those walls was neither normal nor necessary. The winter of 1873 brought hardships that tested the family's survival in ways Ezekiel had not anticipated. Heavy snows isolated them completely for weeks at a time, and the supplies he had stockpiled proved insufficient for the expanded household. The children, particularly those with health problems, suffered from the cold despite the constantly burning fire. Josiah developed a respiratory infection that his cleft palate complicated, and for days his survival seemed uncertain. Ezekiel, faced with the possible loss of a child, finally showed a crack in his authoritarian facade, sitting up through the nights holding his son and praying with genuine desperation rather than ritualistic performance. The girls, seeing their father's fear, experienced a strange mixture of emotions: sympathy for his distress, resentment that he seemed to care more for the children than for them, and a growing awareness that the great work he had promised was producing not excellence but suffering. When Josiah survived and spring finally came, melting the snows and opening the trails again, the family emerged from winter changed in subtle ways. The bonds of absolute obedience, slightly loosened by shared hardship and unspoken doubts that had taken root during the long, dark months when survival mattered more than ideology. The spring of 1874 brought new life and new problems to the isolated cabin as Prudence delivered her third child, a girl named Verity, who appeared healthy but whose arrival pushed the household beyond its capacity to function. 7 people now lived in the single-room structure: Ezekiel, his 3 daughter wives, and 4 children ranging from infancy to 3 years old. The noise was constant, the smell of unwashed bodies and soiled cloths overwhelming, and the emotional atmosphere thick with tensions that no one dared voice openly. Ezekiel had begun showing signs of strain, his journals filling with increasingly erratic entries that mixed self-justification with paranoid fears about discovery. He had started drinking whiskey he distilled himself from corn, claiming it helped him think clearly, but actually making him unpredictable. Sometimes maudlin and affectionate, other times angry and accusatory. The girls learned to read his moods and adjust their behavior accordingly, a survival skill that came naturally after years of having no choice but to please him. That summer brought the event that would eventually lead to the unraveling of Ezekiel's carefully constructed world. Patience, pregnant with her second child, began experiencing complications that even her father's medical books could not adequately address. She bled intermittently, suffered severe pain, and grew increasingly weak as the pregnancy progressed. Ezekiel, terrified of losing one of his wives and facing the possibility that his breeding program was literally killing his daughters, finally made a decision he had resisted for years. He would seek help from the outside world. He left the cabin for the first time in months, traveling to the distant settlement to find a doctor or midwife who might provide guidance. The girls, left alone for 3 days, experienced a strange freedom they had never known. They talked openly about their situation, shared their fears and doubts, and for the first time seriously discussed the possibility that their father's teachings might be wrong. Prudence, the natural leader among them, suggested they could leave, take the children, and walk to the settlement, seek help from the authorities the surveyor had mentioned. But Charity and Patience, terrified of the unknown world and conditioned by years of warnings about what awaited them outside, could not bring themselves to take such a radical step. When Ezekiel returned, he brought with him a midwife named Mrs. Brennan, an older woman who had agreed to come only because he paid her an extraordinary sum and told her a story about his wife having difficulties with a pregnancy. Mrs. Brennan's arrival at the cabin brought the first outside adult perspective on the family situation in over a decade. What she saw shocked her profoundly. 3 young women who looked identical and were clearly sisters, all showing signs of recent or current pregnancy, living in squalid conditions with several small children who appeared neglected or ill. Ezekiel tried to maintain his cover story, claiming the girls were his wife and her sisters, who helped with the children, but Mrs. Brennan was not fooled. She examined Patience and determined that the pregnancy was dangerous and might require intervention beyond what could be provided in the cabin. She also noticed the way the girls deferred to Ezekiel with a fear that went beyond normal respect, the way they would not speak unless he gave permission, and the general atmosphere of control and secrecy that pervaded the household. Mrs. Brennan left the cabin promising to return with supplies, but she went directly to the county sheriff with her suspicions. She described what she had seen: multiple young women who appeared to be sisters, all involved with the same man, children with signs of inbreeding, and conditions that suggested abuse and imprisonment. The sheriff, a practical man named Thomas Wade, was skeptical at first, reluctant to interfere in what might be simply an unconventional family arrangement. But Mrs. Brennan was insistent, and she had a reputation for honesty and good judgment. Sheriff Wade agreed to investigate, though he warned it might take time to organize a party willing to travel into the remote Ozarks and confront a man who was reportedly armed and paranoid. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Ezekiel had realized his mistake in bringing an outsider into his domain. He could see in Mrs. Brennan's eyes that she had understood more than he intended to reveal, and he knew that his world was now at risk of exposure and destruction. The weeks following Mrs. Brennan's visit were marked by escalating tension and Ezekiel's increasingly desperate attempts to prepare for what he saw as an inevitable confrontation. He moved supplies into the root cellar, creating a bunker where the family could hide if authorities came. He drilled the girls on what to say if questioned, coaching them to claim they were willing participants in a religious community, that they were happy and free to leave any time, but chose to stay. He also became more physically affectionate and emotionally manipulative, reminding them constantly of the bond they shared, the children they had created together, and the persecution they would face if separated. The girls, caught between their growing doubts and their lifelong conditioning, did not know how to respond. Prudence had begun to imagine a different life, one where her children might grow up healthy and normal, but she could not envision how to reach it. Charity remained the most loyal to their father, still believing in the special purpose he had described. Patience, weakened by her difficult pregnancy and increasingly aware that she might die, had moved beyond fear into a kind of fatalistic acceptance, waiting to see what would happen next. The cabin, once a sealed world unto itself, had become a pressure vessel waiting to explode, its inhabitants trapped between the only life they had ever known and the terrifying unknown that approached from the outside world. In early autumn of 1874, Sheriff Wade finally organized a party to investigate the Crowley cabin, bringing with him 2 deputies, Mrs. Brennan, and a county judge who could make legal determinations about the children's welfare. The journey took 2 days through difficult terrain, and when they finally approached the property, they found Ezekiel waiting for them on the porch with his rifle across his knees, not aimed, but clearly visible. The sheriff, experienced in dealing with volatile situations, approached slowly and spoke calmly, explaining that they had concerns about the welfare of the children and the young women, that they simply wanted to ensure everyone was safe and healthy. Ezekiel responded with a speech he had clearly rehearsed, declaring that his family was private, that they lived according to their own beliefs which were protected by law, and that he would not allow government interference in his household. The standoff lasted hours, with negotiations going nowhere, as Ezekiel refused to allow anyone inside the cabin or to speak with the girls without his presence. The situation was resolved not by force, but by tragedy. Patience, whose pregnancy complications had worsened during the weeks of stress, suddenly collapsed inside the cabin, her screams of pain audible to everyone outside. Prudence, acting on instinct rather than obedience, threw open the cabin door and begged for help, her conditioning finally breaking in the face of her sister's crisis. Mrs. Brennan rushed inside, followed by the sheriff, and what they found confirmed all her earlier suspicions and worse. Patience was hemorrhaging badly, the cabin was in chaos with crying children, and the other 2 girls paralyzed with fear, and the evidence of the family's true nature was impossible to deny. The midwife worked frantically to save Patience while the sheriff took control of the situation, disarming Ezekiel, who seemed to collapse psychologically once his domain was breached, and beginning to document what he was seeing. The judge, a religious man who had seen much in his years on the bench but nothing quite like this, began the process of taking statements and making decisions about the immediate custody of the children. Patience survived the night, but lost the child she had been carrying, and Mrs. Brennan declared that she would likely never be able to bear children again safely. As dawn broke over the Ozarks, the cabin that had been sealed for so long was fully exposed to outside scrutiny. The sheriff's investigation revealed the full scope of what had occurred. 3 sisters, who were also wives to their own father, 4 children born of incest with various health problems, years of isolation and indoctrination, and a man who had constructed an elaborate justification for acts that the law clearly defined as criminal. Ezekiel, faced with the collapse of his world, alternated between defiant speeches about his rights and his vision, and periods of silent withdrawal where he seemed unable to comprehend that his great work had ended. The triplets, freed from his immediate control, but not from years of conditioning, struggled to understand what was happening, whether they were being rescued or destroyed, and what would become of them and their children. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the unique nature of the case. Ezekiel was arrested and charged with multiple crimes including incest, child abuse, and unlawful imprisonment, though the latter charge was difficult to prove since the girls had never physically tried to leave. The triplets were taken to a church-run home for women in the nearest town, along with their children, where they would receive medical care and begin the long process of learning to function in the world beyond the cabin. The community's reaction was mixed. Horror at what had occurred, but also a disturbing curiosity and judgment directed at the victims themselves. Some people whispered that the girls must have been willing participants, that they could have escaped if they truly wanted to, failing to understand the psychological chains that can be stronger than physical ones. Mrs. Brennan became their advocate, explaining to anyone who would listen that these young women had been groomed and controlled since infancy, that they knew no other reality, and that they deserved compassion rather than condemnation. The children presented the most heartbreaking aspect of the case. Medical examinations confirmed that Ezekiel Jr. and Josiah both suffered from conditions consistent with inbreeding, developmental delays, and physical abnormalities that would affect them for life. Faith and Hope showed milder problems, but would require ongoing monitoring. Verity, the youngest, appeared healthy, but was too young for definitive assessment. The question of what to do with these children, products of incest who needed specialized care, troubled everyone involved. Some argued they should be placed in institutions, others that they should remain with their mothers who loved them despite everything. The judge, trying to balance the children's needs with the reality that separating them from the only parents they knew would cause additional trauma, made a provisional ruling that the triplets could keep their children while living under supervision at the church home, with regular medical and psychological evaluations to ensure everyone's welfare. It was an imperfect solution to an impossible situation, an attempt to provide some stability, while the legal system processed the unprecedented case and decided the fate of a family that should never have existed. The trial of Ezekiel Crowley in the spring of 1875 became a sensation that drew attention from newspapers across Missouri and beyond, a lurid tale that combined elements of religious extremism, sexual deviance, and the dark possibilities of isolation. Ezekiel, defended by a lawyer, who argued that his client was insane and therefore not responsible for his actions, presented a strange figure in the courtroom, sometimes lucid and defiant, insisting he had done nothing wrong and had simply followed principles found in ancient texts and natural law, other times confused and pathetic, seeming not to understand why his family had been taken from him. The prosecution called Mrs. Brennan, Sheriff Wade, and medical experts who testified about the children's conditions and the psychological state of the triplets. The most difficult moments came when Prudence, Charity, and Patience were called to testify, required to describe their lives in the cabin and their relationships with their father, in front of a courtroom full of strangers whose expressions ranged from sympathy to disgust. The triplets' testimony revealed the complexity of their situation in ways that made simple judgments impossible. Prudence, who had developed the most independence during the months away from the cabin, described the fear and control that had governed their lives, the way their father had shaped their understanding of reality from infancy, and the growing doubts she had experienced as the children's problems became undeniable. But even she struggled to fully condemn Ezekiel, conditioned by years of being told that he loved them and was protecting them from a hostile world. Charity remained more loyal, insisting under cross-examination that she had never wanted to leave, that she believed in the principles her father taught, and that the outside world had destroyed something sacred by interfering. Patience, still recovering physically and emotionally from her near-death experience, gave the most heartbreaking testimony, describing in a flat, emotionless voice the rituals in the root cellar, the pregnancies and births with no medical care, and the moment she realized she might die and leave her children alone. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as these three young women, identical in appearance but diverging in their responses to trauma, revealed the reality of life in the cabin. The defense's insanity argument failed to convince the jury, who deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, called Ezekiel's crimes among the most disturbing he had encountered in decades on the bench, a systematic abuse of the most fundamental trust between parent and child, compounded by the creation of children who would suffer the consequences of his actions for their entire lives. He sentenced Ezekiel to 20 years in the state prison, the maximum allowed under the laws of the time, though many in the courtroom felt even that was insufficient punishment. Ezekiel, hearing the sentence, showed no emotion, simply nodding as if confirming something he had already known. As he was led away in chains, he turned to look at his daughters one last time, and the expression on his face was not remorse, but a kind of bewildered sadness, as if he genuinely could not understand why the world had rejected his vision of purity and purpose. With Ezekiel imprisoned, the focus shifted to the question of what would become of the triplets and their children. The church home where they had been living provided basic care, but was not equipped for long-term residence, and the community's initial sympathy had begun to fade as the sensational details of the case became public knowledge. Some families offered to take individual children, but the triplets refused to be separated from their offspring, despite the difficulties of caring for them. Prudence emerged as the spokesperson for the three, arguing that they had been victims of their father's crimes and deserved a chance to build normal lives, that with education and support, they could become productive members of society. The judge, moved by her plea and recognizing that punishing the victims further served no purpose, arranged for the family to be relocated to a larger town where they could live in a supervised boarding house, receive training in practical skills, and gradually integrate into the community while their children received medical and educational services. The transition was neither easy nor complete. The triplets, now 19 years old, had to learn everything that most people absorbed gradually through childhood and adolescence: how to interact with strangers, how to manage money, how to navigate social expectations and norms. They attracted attention wherever they went, their identical appearance and the whispered knowledge of their history making them objects of curiosity and gossip. Some people were kind, offering friendship and assistance without judgment. Others were cruel, making comments or asking invasive questions that revealed prurient interest rather than genuine concern. The girls learned to protect themselves by staying together, presenting a united front to the world, and gradually developing the skills they needed to survive independently. Prudence proved the most adaptable, eventually finding work as a seamstress and becoming the primary breadwinner. Charity struggled more, often retreating into silence and the religious texts that reminded her of her father's teachings, unable to fully accept that the life she had known was wrong. Patience, her health permanently damaged, focused on caring for the children, finding in motherhood a purpose that helped her make sense of her experiences. The years following the trial brought gradual healing and persistent challenges for the family that had emerged from the Ozark cabin. By 1876, 2 years after their rescue, the triplets had established a fragile stability in their new lives. They lived in a modest house on the edge of town, supported partly by their own earnings and partly by a fund established by charitable citizens who recognized that the young women needed ongoing assistance. The children were growing, and while Ezekiel Jr. and Josiah would never be fully healthy or independent, they showed small improvements with proper medical care and the stimulation of a more normal environment. Faith and Hope were attending a school for children with special needs, learning basic skills, and socializing with other youngsters for the first time. Verity, now 2 years old, appeared to be developing normally and gave everyone hope that at least one child might escape the full consequences of her origins. The triplets themselves were evolving in different directions as they encountered the wider world and began to form individual identities separate from the collective existence they had known in the cabin. Prudence, always the boldest, had begun a tentative friendship with a young man who worked at the general store, a relationship that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure as she contemplated the possibility of normal courtship and marriage. She had nightmares about her father, dreams where he appeared and told her she was betraying the family, but she was learning to distinguish between the voice of her conditioning and her own desires. Charity had found solace in a local church, though her religious expression troubled the pastor, who noticed that her prayers and interpretations of Scripture sometimes echoed the distorted theology her father had taught. She remained the most conflicted of the three, unable to fully embrace the outside world's condemnation of what had happened in the cabin, still believing on some level that there had been purpose and meaning in their suffering. Patience had taken a different path, focusing entirely on her children and showing little interest in the broader world. The physical trauma of her last pregnancy had left her with chronic pain and a fragility that made her seem older than her years. She rarely spoke about the cabin or her father, maintaining a silence that worried those who tried to help her process her experiences. But in her care for Josiah, the son whose birth had nearly killed her and who required constant attention due to his cleft palate and other problems, she showed a fierce protective love that suggested deep reserves of strength. She had become an expert in his care, learning techniques from doctors and developing her own methods for feeding him and helping him communicate. In some ways, her focus on practical caregiving allowed her to avoid confronting the larger questions about her past. but it also gave her a role and identity that felt authentic in a way nothing else did. The community's relationship with the family remained complicated and sometimes painful. Most people were kind in a distant way, offering polite greetings but maintaining social distance, uncomfortable with the family's history and uncertain how to interact with victims of such unusual crimes. A few families had embraced the triplets more fully, inviting them to social gatherings and treating them as normal young women, rather than curiosities or objects of pity. But there were also those who whispered that the girls must have been willing participants, that they could have escaped or resisted, revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of how psychological control works, and a need to believe that such things only happen to people who somehow allow them. The triplets learned to ignore the gossip and focus on the people who offered genuine support, but the constant awareness of being watched and judged took its toll, adding to the challenges of building new lives from the ruins of their old existence. As the second anniversary of their rescue approached in autumn of 1876, the triplets received news that forced them to confront their past in a new way. Ezekiel had died in prison, killed in a fight with another inmate over circumstances that were never fully explained. The warden sent a letter informing them of his death and asking whether they wanted to claim his body for burial or if the state should handle his interment. The question sparked the first serious disagreement among the sisters since leaving the cabin. Prudence felt they should let the state bury him, that he deserved no ceremony or acknowledgement from the family he had damaged. Charity insisted they had a duty as daughters to see him properly laid to rest, that whatever his crimes, he was still their father and had believed he was acting out of love. Patience, as usual, said little, but eventually sided with Charity, perhaps out of a need for closure or perhaps from lingering loyalty. She could not fully explain. They arranged for his body to be brought back to the Ozarks and buried in a small cemetery near where the cabin still stood, empty now and slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The funeral of Ezekiel Crowley was attended by only 5 people: his 3 daughter wives, the pastor who agreed to perform a brief service, and Sheriff Wade, who came out of a sense of duty to see the case fully closed. They stood in cold autumn rain beside a grave that had been dug in the far corner of the cemetery, as far as possible from the respectable families interred there, and listened as the pastor read generic passages about forgiveness and divine judgment. None of the triplets cried, their faces showing different expressions that reflected their divergent relationships with the man being buried. Prudence looked angry. Her jaw clenched as she stared at the simple wooden coffin. Charity appeared sad but composed, her lips moving in silent prayer. Patience seemed absent, her gaze focused on something beyond the cemetery, perhaps seeing the cabin and the life they had lived there, perhaps seeing nothing at all. When the service ended and the first shovelfuls of dirt hit the coffin, they turned and walked away without looking back, 3 identical figures in dark dresses moving through the rain toward the wagon that would take them back to town and the lives they were still learning to live. The death of their father marked a psychological turning point for the triplets, a definitive end to the possibility that he might somehow return and reclaim control over them. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes became apparent in their behavior and attitudes. Prudence became more confident and forward-looking, accepting the courtship of the young man from the general store and beginning to plan for a future that included marriage and perhaps children born of love rather than coercion. She had nightmares less frequently, and when they came, she was able to wake and remind herself that the cabin was empty, her father was dead, and she was free to make her own choices. Charity's response was more complicated, a mixture of grief and relief that left her withdrawn and contemplative. She spent long hours in church praying for her father's soul and her own, trying to reconcile the love she had felt for him with the growing understanding that what he had done was wrong. She would never fully resolve this conflict, carrying it with her for the rest of her life as a source of both pain and a strange kind of purpose. Patience, surprisingly, showed the most dramatic change after Ezekiel's death. The silence that had characterized her for months began to break, and she started talking about her experiences in a way she never had before. She described to her sisters the moment during her difficult labor when she had realized she might die and had felt not fear but a kind of liberation. a recognition that death would free her from the life her father had created. She talked about the anger she felt toward him for what he had done to them and their children, an anger she had suppressed for years under layers of obedience and conditioning. This emergence of emotion was painful to witness, but also healthy, a necessary part of processing trauma that she had delayed too long. Her sisters listened and shared their own feelings, and for the first time since childhood, they talked honestly about their father not as the authority figure who defined their reality, but as a man who had committed terrible crimes against them. These conversations among the sisters led to a collective decision that would shape the rest of their lives. They agreed that they needed to tell their story publicly, not in the sensational way the newspapers had done during the trial, but in their own words and on their own terms. They wanted other isolated families to know that what seemed like religious devotion or alternative lifestyle might actually be abuse, wanted other young people trapped in controlling situations to understand that escape was possible, and wanted the world to recognize that victims of such crimes deserved compassion rather than judgment. Prudence, with her growing confidence and communication skills, took the lead in writing an account of their experiences. It was published first in a regional newspaper and later expanded into a pamphlet that was distributed by reform organizations concerned with child welfare and women's rights. The account was frank, but not gratuitously detailed, focusing on the psychological mechanisms of control and the long process of recovery, rather than the sensational aspects that had dominated earlier coverage. The publication of their story brought both positive and negative consequences. Many people responded with support and admiration for their courage, and the triplets received letters from other survivors of family abuse who found validation and hope in their words. Reform organizations invited them to speak at gatherings, and they became reluctant advocates for legal changes that would better protect children from parental abuse and provide more resources for victims trying to rebuild their lives. But the publicity also brought renewed gossip and judgment, with some people accusing them of seeking attention or profiting from their victimization. The triplets learned to accept that they could not control how others perceived them, that telling their truth was valuable, regardless of how it was received. By the end of 1876, they had established themselves not just as victims of a terrible crime, but as survivors who were actively working to create meaning from their suffering and to prevent others from experiencing similar fates. As 1877 began, the triplets found themselves at a crossroads, looking back at the journey from the cabin to their current lives and forward to futures that remained uncertain but were at least their own to shape. Prudence married her young man in a simple ceremony that spring, becoming the first of the sisters to establish a life fully separate from their shared past. Her husband, a kind man who accepted her history without judgment, helped her raise Ezekiel Jr. and Verity while they started a family of their own. The birth of Prudence's first child, conceived in love rather than coercion, was an emotional milestone. A healthy daughter who represented hope and normalcy, Prudence often looked at this new baby and her older children side by side, seeing in their differences the contrast between the life she had escaped and the life she was building, and feeling gratitude mixed with sorrow for all that had been lost and all that was being gained. Charity never married, choosing instead to dedicate herself to religious work and the care of Faith, her daughter from the cabin years. She joined a religious community that ran an orphanage and school, finding in service to other damaged children a way to process her own experiences and create something positive from her pain. She remained the most conflicted of the three sisters, never fully rejecting her father's memory or teachings, but channeling the intensity of belief he had instilled in her toward genuinely helping others rather than controlling them. Her faith was complicated and sometimes troubling to those around her, but it was authentic and it gave her life structure and meaning. She wrote letters to her sisters regularly, maintaining the bond that had sustained them through their worst times, and occasionally visited to see her nieces and nephews and marvel at how normal childhood could be when it was allowed to unfold naturally. Patience remained in the house they had first moved to after leaving the cabin, focusing her life on caring for Josiah and Hope, both of whom required ongoing medical attention and special education. She never sought romantic relationships, seeming content or perhaps simply resigned to a life defined by motherhood and caregiving. The chronic health problems from her last pregnancy persisted, and doctors warned that she might not live a normal lifespan, but she faced this possibility with the same quiet acceptance she brought to everything. She found unexpected joy in small moments. Josiah learning to communicate through signs and sounds despite his speech impediments. Hope mastering a new skill at school, the garden she tended that reminded her of the one at the cabin, but was hers to plant as she chose. She rarely spoke about the past, but sometimes her sisters would find her standing at the window, looking toward the mountains, and they knew she was remembering the only home she had known for most of her life, a place of horror and love, so tangled together they could never be fully separated. The children born in the cabin grew up knowing their origins, a truth the triplets decided was better shared honestly than hidden and discovered later. They explained in age-appropriate ways that their grandfather had been confused and had done things that were wrong, that their mothers had been victims who had not understood they had choices, and that the family's unusual beginning did not define who they were or what they could become. Ezekiel Jr., despite his limitations, grew into a gentle young man who worked in his stepfather's store and was loved in the community for his kind nature. Josiah's physical problems remained severe, but he developed a sharp intelligence and a talent for mathematics that surprised his teachers. Faith and hope became inseparable companions, supporting each other through the challenges of their developmental delays and finding happiness in simple pleasures. Verity, the youngest and healthiest, showed no obvious effects of her origins and grew into a bright, curious child who asked endless questions about the world, each question a reminder of how different her life was from her mother's isolated childhood. By 1880, 4 years after Ezekiel's death, the family had achieved a stability that once seemed impossible. They were not without problems or pain, and the scars of their early years would never fully heal, but they had built lives that were fundamentally different from the one imposed on them in the cabin. They had learned that healing was not a destination, but a process. That recovery meant not forgetting the past, but refusing to let it determine the future. The triplets remained close, their bond forged in shared trauma, but sustained by genuine love and mutual support. They had survived something that should have destroyed them, and in their survival and their determination to create better lives for their children, they had achieved a kind of victory over the man who had tried to make them extensions of his will, rather than people with their own rights and dreams. The cabin in the Ozarks had long since collapsed, its logs rotting back into the forest floor, but the family that had emerged from it continued, changed and damaged, but also resilient and determined to write their own ending to a story that had begun in darkness and isolation. The final chapter of the triplets' story extends beyond the immediate aftermath of their rescue into the broader question of how communities and legal systems respond to family abuse, and how survivors create meaning from trauma. The case of the Crowley family became a reference point in discussions about parental rights versus children's welfare, contributing to gradual legal reforms that gave authorities more power to intervene in isolated family situations and provided better resources for victims of incest and family abuse. The triplets' willingness to speak publicly about their experiences, despite the personal cost, helped shift public understanding from viewing such victims with suspicion or prurient curiosity to recognizing them as people who deserved support and compassion. Their advocacy work, though it was never their primary focus, had ripple effects that benefited others trapped in similar situations, giving those victims hope that escape and recovery were possible. The question of how to remember and contextualize what happened in the Ozark cabin remained complicated. Some people wanted to forget the whole sordid affair, to let it fade into history as an aberration best not discussed. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and unchecked parental authority, a reminder that communities have responsibilities to watch for and respond to signs of abuse, even when families claim religious or philosophical justifications for their practices. The triplets themselves had mixed feelings about their story's legacy. Prudence wanted it remembered as a story of survival and recovery, emphasizing the second half of their lives rather than the first. Charity hoped it might lead people to examine their own beliefs and relationships, to question whether what they called faith or tradition might actually be control or abuse. Patience, characteristically, said little about legacy, focusing instead on the daily work of living and caring for those who depended on her. As the triplets aged, they each found different ways to make peace with their past. Prudence, surrounded by a growing family that included children and eventually grandchildren born of healthy relationships, saw her life as proof that cycles of abuse could be broken, that victims could become survivors, and then simply people living normal lives. She rarely thought about the cabin in her later years, her memories of it fading like old photographs, replaced by decades of happier experiences. Charity, who lived longest of the three sisters, eventually wrote a memoir in her 70s that explored the religious and psychological dimensions of their experience, with a depth and honesty that surprised those who read it. She had spent a lifetime trying to understand how love and abuse had been so thoroughly mixed in their father's treatment of them, and her memoir offered no easy answers, but asked important questions about faith, family, and the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. Patience died relatively young, in her early 40s, from complications related to her damaged reproductive system and the general toll that years of inadequate nutrition and repeated pregnancies had taken on her body. Her sisters were with her at the end, and her last words were reportedly about her children, expressing satisfaction that she had lived long enough to see them established in lives better than her own had been. Her funeral was well attended by people from the community who had come to respect her quiet strength and dedication, and her grave was placed in the same cemetery where Ezekiel was buried, though on the opposite side, as far from him as the boundaries allowed. The symbolism was not lost on those who knew the family's history. Even in death, the victims maintained distance from their abuser, claiming space that was their own. The children born in the cabin lived out their lives with varying degrees of success and happiness. Some struggled with health problems and the psychological weight of their origins throughout their lives. Others managed to build relatively normal existences, their unusual beginnings becoming simply one fact among many in their personal histories. None of them repeated the patterns of their grandfather, all of them having learned from their mother's experiences the importance of consent, autonomy, and healthy relationships. By the time the last of them died in the mid-20th century, the story of the Ozark cabin had faded from public memory, known only to family members and a few historians who studied cases of extreme family abuse. But the lessons of that story remained relevant. That isolation enables abuse, that victims of family crimes deserve support rather than judgment, that recovery is possible but requires resources and compassion, and that the human spirit has a remarkable capacity to survive and even flourish after experiencing darkness that should have been destroying. The cabin itself was gone, reclaimed by the forest, but the family that had emerged from it continued through generations, each one further removed from that origin point, each one writing their own story rather than living out someone else's twisted vision of purity and control.